Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. Alright, so this video is going to serve as a kind of introduction to my Sword and Sorcery Saga series, and you could think of it as what is Sword and Sorcery. Now, I am no expert, not even close. For every book I've read in the genre, there are probably 10 I haven't read, and I have a feeling that people who are going to be commenting on these videos probably know a lot more than I do. That's usually how things go, right? But in this series, we will be looking at 3 kinds of related subgenres, and all of them are subgenres of fantasy. And those are Sword and Sorcery, Sword and Planet, and Heroic Fantasy. Now, there's going to be one major caveat, is I will not be spending a lot of time with Robert E. Howard's Conan. That's not to say that I'm going to avoid that author or character entirely. If a Conan story appears in an anthology, I will look at it and read it. And we will also be looking at other Robert E. Howard creations. I'm just not going to focus on Conan just because there's so much coverage of the character and his stories already on YouTube and the internet. So Sword and Sorcery and Sword and Planet stories probably date back roughly to the early 30s, 1932, according to Lynn Carter, who says that Robert E. Howard invented the genre. Sword and Planet is probably quite a bit earlier, and those are like with examples like Edgar Rice Burroughs, his planetary romances, the Princess of Mars, and those kinds of stories. Sword and Sorcery can largely be defined by the stories that appeared in the pages of Weird Tales, as well as early anthologies and pulp magazines. Anthologies collected and edited by L. Sprague de Camp, and later by Lynn Carter and others. The term was most likely coined by Fritz Leiber, the creator of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories, sometime after the first of its stories were published, again according to Lynn Carter. I say according to Lynn Carter, take this with a grain of salt. While I love everything he did for genre fiction and appreciate, just everything he's done for fantasy fiction specifically, there are some more in the know than myself who accuse Carter of being a little fast and loose with the facts. An easy way for us to define these kinds of stories is as follows. These are largely the kinds of stories that have inspired and informed the kinds of games I cover on the Dungeon Dive, the kinds of games we like to play. You could say that most of the games that I cover on the Dungeon Dive, the kinds of games we love, were all largely inspired by Dungeons and Dragons in some way. And D&D includes a famous list of fiction which inspired it, and that would be Appendix N. So another name for this genre could be Appendix N fiction, although the fiction found on Appendix N covers a wider range of subgenres that I'm going to cover in this series. For some, the term heroic fantasy is synonymous with Sword and Sorcery, and for other, the term predates Sword and Sorcery, predates it all, and is pretty much like it can be found at the genesis in the very myths and legends that all of our modern stories are built upon. The Greek and Roman mythologies are examples of heroic fantasy. I guess in many ways, the heroic tales found in the world's ancient myths, legends, really are the true genesis of all of these ideas, but I'm not going to be covering that kind of stuff. But things get messy when you start defining a genre. Is aliens science fiction or horror? Is aliens science fiction, horror, or action? There are always works that span multiple genres, some things that people consider one while others consider another, and things that don't fit nicely into one genre. We define genres really just to create a kind of roadmap, or a large box that we can put things in for the purpose of discussion. In other words, I may not be able to define it, but I know it when I see it. And other people will sometimes agree or disagree. And it's useful purely for the sake of discussions and for making lists like this. It's useful but not crucial. And I'm sure there will be some arguments about some things I'm leaving out or some things I am including, and that is fine. One of the best ways to define a subgenre is to look at the stories that have been anthologized in that subgenre's most respected collections by that subgenre's most respected editors. And that's largely what I will be doing. Folks like L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, they will be kind of my guides through this subgenre. These are the experts, these are the people and others that I will be turning to on this quest. Here are some of the elements that I think separate sword and sorcery from other forms of fantasy fiction like high fantasy and epic fantasy. 1, the stories and novels are usually shorter. If you put up 20 novels on a shelf with their covers covered and told somebody to pick the examples of sword and sorcery out, if they just picked the slimmest volumes, they would probably pick 100% correctly. They are not 2, they are not epic in scope. 3, they are not as concerned with world building as they are with depicting exciting scenarios. Think of high and epic fantasy as a campaign source book, and think of sword and sorcery as the adventure module. 4, the fate of the world usually is not threatened. 5, the heroes in these stories are just trying to survive to make ends meet. 6, the heroes are usually less altruistic, more selfish, in it to win it, to get that loot, to get paid, to get revenge. 7, they're usually more humorous, bawdy, violent, and flippant. A great example of many of these elements can be found in the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser novel, The Swords of Lankhmar. Sword and Planet, also known as planetary romance, is sword and sorcery in space. This fiction will usually take the ideas above and add a couple important elements, such as 1, they're usually fish out of water stories in which a hero from Earth is somehow teleported to another very alien planet. 2, these stories are absolutely not concerned with how the science part works. All planets have Earth-like atmospheres. Technology is magic, magic is technology. These stories usually deal with the hero trying to get back home. They take place in science fiction and post-apocalyptic settings, and will sometimes examine the clash between ancient and modern technology, swords versus lasers. I think Star Wars: A New Hope is really an example of a sword and planet. One thing to remember is that setting doesn't always dictate the genre. Sword and sorcery on Mars is not science fiction, it's science fantasy or sword and planet. These are just some of the things I've noticed while reading some of this fiction. They're not being presented as the one and only true definitions of these subgenres. Again, I'm just kind of creating a map for us to work from. We will need to address one thing, and it's kind of a touchy subject, and that is the misogyny and depictions of women in these stories. I just recently picked up the Taschen huge, like 20-pound coffee table book, Masterworks of Fantasy Art, and my wife and I were looking through it, and she commented that, just every single page there is a naked woman, and it's true. But also, a lot of times, the men are also almost as naked. We need to address the cover art. The cover art you're seeing in this video are all books that I am considering for this series, so it's no secret that I love vintage paperback art and vintage paperbacks. I collect them because of the art, and I love the pictures that you are seeing. But a lot of the pictures are of naked or half-naked people on the covers, both men and women. The depictions of men and women on these covers are incredibly idealized. And that is something that all of the artists talk openly about, male and female artists in that Taschen book. I would argue that sword and sorcery really is part of a larger body genre. These are works of fiction, mainly films like martial arts films, that worship and fetishize the human body in some idealized peak form. And it's probably a holdover from the ancient myths and legends which did the same. The men on the covers of these books have great butts with thick muscular legs, chiseled abs and chest, square jaws, tree trunk arms, and the women often do too, but with breasts. And both are usually wearing nothing more than tattered loincloths, if that. However, one of the big differences is that men are more often than not in positions of power, while the women are more often than not the victims, the captives, and the rewards to be won by the men. I know this isn't always the case, but it happens to be a norm. I will be pointing this out when I see it and read it. This doesn't mean that I dislike these stories or authors or I don't want people to read them. Quite the contrary. I think we should still be reading these stories, and it's important to discuss their good and their problematic qualities. The misogyny issues, these aren't being brought up to end discussion, they're being brought up to further, to start discussion. Same as the racism that can be prevalent in some of these early stories, and same as the otherness, the other being the enemy. And I will also be looking at examples that buck these trends and spending time researching and reading women authors who write in this genre about women heroes. So that is about it. The rest of this video is going to play out for a few minutes with some music I wrote, with showing some more covers. And so I really hope you guys enjoy this series. It's going to be a long one. I'm going to try to do maybe one video a month. It's going to be a slow series because I need to read these books. I'm going to try to cover 2 to 3 books on each episode. The first official episode will be covering 3 classic anthologies from L. Spragg de Camp. So, all right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed this, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye.